Hi, everyone. We're just going to give up another minute or so before we get started. Thanks again for joining. All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. My name is Alyssa O'Rourke. I'm with Camilla and Matthew McConaughey's Greenlights Grant Initiative. I'm thrilled to be with you all today for our first Greenlights Grant Initiative webinar. Federal grants, as you all know, can be a game changer, but they can also be extremely difficult to navigate. We're here today to help you break down that process and help bring federal grant dollars to your district. We want you to walk away today feeling confident and ready to tap into those readily available resources for your community that are so important. Matthew and Camilla are so excited for you to be joining us in an effort to make sure America's students are safe, secure, and healthy. We all have a role to play, and we're so thankful that you're doing yours. With that, I'd like to now share a message that Matthew McConaughey prepared for you all.
Hello, everybody. Matthew McConaughey here with the Greenlights Grant Initiative. I want to welcome you to the Getting Ready for Grants webinar. It's an overview of federal grants and what's needed to apply. Now, our goal here is to help connect your district to federal grant dollars to help keep your students safe and healthy. This is the first webinar of many by the Greenlights Grant Initiative, and we hope that you will join us for every one of them. Today, you will be introduced to key concepts and resources to increase your understanding of, readiness for, and competitiveness for federal grant funding. Thank you for joining, and in the meantime and all times, just keep living.
Thank you. And with
Hello,
that,
everybody. Matthew McConaughey here with the Greenlight.
Sorry about that. With that, I'll turn it over to Sasha Podolsky, our strategic partner, advocacy director at AASA, the School Superintendents Association. Sasha?
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. And I know we want to get to Annie, our fantastic presenter. But I just want to say on behalf of the School Superintendents Association, how proud we are to have this partnership with Greenlight Grants Initiative, and to know that, this is an issue that we have long been struggling with at the federal level, and are so relieved and appreciative of the fact that Matthew and Camilla have stepped in to really ensure that districts of all sizes and capacities can begin to access the federal funding that they so need for school safety. And it's a great partnership. We know this is the first of many webinars we will be doing. And so we hope that you continue to sign up and continue to stay engaged with us. And of course, when those grant applications actually are out in the spring, that's when this work will really come to fruition, where we'll really be able to provide that critical TA to make sure you can pull down those resources. But at this point, this is just getting you ready for grants, as is the title of the webinar. So with that, I will now turn things over to Annie Kurowski.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha, and hi, everyone, and welcome to this introductory webinar. I am Annie Brown Kurowski. I'm a vice president at McAllister Quinn. My background has been in and around government my entire career. I worked on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate for a number of years, doing domestic policy, including education policy, behavioral health, healthcare, sort of running the gamut in all domestic policy. So I worked on the Senate side, and then later in my career, I actually worked for a grant funding agency, the Corporation for National and Community Service, which implements and awards all of those large AmeriCorps programs. So in my role here at MNQ, I've been a managing director and then a senior managing director. So I've really gotten into how to manage and prepare for these large federal grant programs for most of my career. So I'm really happy to share what knowledge we have and our expertise in this area with you all today to really take some mystery out of preparing for and organizing and preparing to write a federal grant application. So next slide. So just a little bit about MNQ McAllister Quinn. We are a Washington, D.C. based consulting firm. We were founded in 2004. And our real focus of our business is that we specialize in securing federal funding for a wide range of our clients. We have about 200 now clients, and these run the gamut between nonprofit, public agencies, healthcare organizations, higher ed institutions, and also now some advanced technology. We have a very experienced staff. We're 90 plus and growing. Most of us come from government, from Capitol Hill, with congressional experience. We also have some of our folks here that have come from grant-making agencies or have been development directors in the past. Together, we work with our huge and growing network of grant consultants. These are subject matter experts who have also come from the agencies and have worked in and around grants and have written and won federal grant applications in the past for most of their career. And given this experience, it's led us to really assist our clients in being successful in the federal grant spectrum. And we are really looking forward to sharing that experience with you today. So next slide. So today we're going to cover an overview of the federal grants landscape, particularly what the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funds. We're going to get started and go through some general information on how to register and apply for federal grants out of the BISCA grants, how to identify good fit grant opportunities for your school and for LEAs and SEAs, and also end by really talking about some tips for writing a competitive federal grant application. So that's what we'll cover today. So next slide, please. So the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was legislation that was passed in 2022 by President Biden to really address the first significant federal gun safety bill in nearly 3 decades. So the legislation provides about $3.6 billion towards community violence intervention and grants to really help schools with security upgrades, including mental health services, so counseling services, and other programming to make our schools safer. Grants are available at the state and federal level for schools and school districts and nonprofits through several departments, including the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education. So next slide. So available school safety grants through the Department of Justice really focus on training violence prevention and allowing school security coordination with law enforcement. Some of these grants are highlighted here. The Bureau of Justice Assistance Stop School Violence Grant Program, the COPS Office School Violence Prevention Program, and the Office of Juvenile Justice Prevention, Enhancing School Capacity to Address School Violence. And these grants will all be highlighted in the resources section later in the presentation at the end, so that it provides links and some other additional resources, which you can read a little bit more about these grants as well. So next slide. Other school safety grants are available through the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is more focused on substance abuse and mental health. So there you will find a couple of grants that are relevant to your schools, which are Project Aware and also Mental Health Awareness and training grants, and these are about preparing your school administrators and school staff in addressing and training to address issues of mental health services needed for your students in your schools. So next slide. The Department of Education grants are very similar, and those include the Mental Health Services Professional Demonstration Grants, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, the School-Based Mental Health Services Grants, and also the Stronger Connections Grant Program. So these are all available through the Department of Education. So next slide. So getting started. This is the most important step that you all can take in terms of registering and getting ready to actually apply for federal grants. So these registrations are absolutely critical because they allow you to actually upload and submit your federal grant applications and actually receive the funding once you are funded. So the first step in registration, in your registrations, are obtaining an EIN number. This is an employer identification number that the IRS requires and that you will need to apply for if you don't have one already. It may take up to 5 weeks to get your EIN number, so you want to do this very early. There are live links here to the IRS in order to do that, so you will want to do that early. You will also need to register with SAM. This is the System for Awards Management, and this will allow you to receive a unique entity identification number, and that number is used to identify the organization in order to receive the awards. This registration through SAMS is renewed every 12 months, so you will need to designate an eBiz point of contact in your organization. This is typically your CFO or your COO, whomever is handling your school's financing. That is the person you will want to designate as your eBiz point of contact. And getting this registration completed may take up to 2 weeks. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's a little slower. So please do this early in your registration process. After you receive your SAMS identification, you will need to register with grants.gov. This is the primary portal for the federal government for all federal grants in the submission process. It's necessary for you to be able to upload and submit your grant, and this is the main portal to do so. The grants.gov link is there. You'll want to click at the top of the banner on the grants.gov website, and that will allow you to register your school and your organization with grants.gov. Within grants.gov, you'll need to designate what's called an authorized organization representative. And this is the person who's actually going to be uploading and submitting your grant and putting in all the information about your organization within the portal for that grant. We really recommend that you actually register at least 2 people from your organization as an AOR, just in case if somebody goes on vacation. You need to have a password to be able to access grants.gov. So it's really important that you have more than 1 person in your organization that can act as an AOR. For all of those Department of Justice grants, the Department of Justice has their own portal. So you will need to register through Just Grants, and the link is there. You will need to have similar information that you have for grants.gov. So you'll need your employer identification number and your SAMS ID in order to register with Just Grants as well. Register with ERA Commons, and these are for the SAMHSA grants. So you will need to register your program director with an ERA Commons ID, and these are for all the SAMHSA grants. So these are all of those mental health counseling grants that you will be applying to through grants.gov. Next slide, please. So how to identify federal grants? Where do you go to find the federal grants that are listed? So grants.gov has a daily forecast and notice of funding opportunity announcements. So those are actually the grant applications, the NOFOs is how we call that. Notice of funding opportunity is what that stands for. So you can go into grants.gov and actually receive daily updates about grants through the Department of Education or through the Department of Health and Human Services, but grants.gov, you can go on that every day and scroll through the available grants. I will also note that the GGI will keep these updated on the website. So all of the grants that we discussed today through BISCA and some of the other grants will be updated on their website too as we get closer to January, so that you can stay informed about when to expect and when those NOFOs come out. There are also agency forecasts through SAMHSA, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Education. You can go on their websites, just Google Department of Education, and you can go on there and they have grant updates and agency forecasts for the coming months and for the coming year. So that's also a great resource. There are also other subscription services like CLASP and Pivot. But I think for your purposes, mostly the agency websites are a great resource for you, as well as grants.gov. Grant cycles, they're typically annual. They can be biannual or every 3 to 5 years. Particularly for the BISCA grants, all of those are annual. So they will come out every year, typically during the same time. And the NOFOs really don't change significantly. So that's a benefit of these types of grants, is that they do come out annually. Deadlines can typically vary, but once the NOFO comes out, you typically have about 45 to 90 days to respond to the proposal. So that's why it's very important to prepare early for these grant applications, because you do only have between 45 to 90 days. That may sound like a lot of time, but when you can start planning and writing a grant, it's really can be very short. So you will want to prepare early for writing and submitting a grant. So there's no typical grant season. Grants come out all throughout the year. Some agencies have different types of funding cycles, but typically there's no grant season. They can come out all year round. So next cycle. So identifying opportunities. So in looking at all of the BISCA grants that we had noted before, some of those that are of interest for GGI and for all of you, there are also other grants that all of the LEAs, SEAs can apply to, and local schools may want to apply to through these agencies. I will say that most of the SAMHSA grants are really looking towards reducing barriers to high quality programs in reducing substance use disorder and improve mental health. So these grants really look towards improving capacity and building capacity for access to mental health services within your schools. So that's being able to hire more counselors, expand your services available to students, and partnerships with nonprofits as well. The Department of Education really supports local education agencies and nonprofits in partnerships with schools. The Department of Justice really focuses on partnerships with law enforcement and local law enforcement to really have a community-based approach to school-based and community violence. So Department of Justice grants are also a good resource for grant opportunities for schools and school districts. And then again, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, that really looks at juvenile justice and child protection programs, but there are a lot of other related school violence prevention programs through OJJDP. So next slide. So what makes a good fit grant? So the first thing when you're looking at a NOFO or looking at a funding opportunity, what you really want to focus on is the eligibility. Are you eligible? The most obvious criteria. So is this grant funding LEAs or SEAs or nonprofit organizations? So really make sure you read the eligibility criteria carefully to make sure that your school is eligible to apply. Second, we really encourage you to look at the overall number of awards. So you wouldn't want to go after a competition that only has 2 awards or 3 awards. Typically, when we're working with individuals applying, we would not recommend you going after an award with less than approximately 25 awards. You want to go after a grant that has quite a large pool of potential awards. So you want to look at the wide range and the number of awards that agency or that grant is looking to fund. Also, you really want to look, this is a great resource, is look at previous awards and proposals. So who was funded in the past? You can look at and request FOIAs. This is the Freedom of Information Act of previously awarded proposals. And some of the agencies will list abstracts of little small explanations of what the grant did before previously in the organization that was funded, because it is all public information. This is public money that's going into this and into federal grants. So really take some time and look who was funded in the past. Do they look like you? Do they serve the same numbers of students? Are they doing similar programming at the school? So really look at who was funded in the past. And look at the funding amount. Is it really worth your time to be applying to this grant? Is it going to cover the resources that you need covered within that funding amount? And look at the geographical distribution. So has the funding been focused on particularly prioritizing certain communities, so opportunity zones or rural areas? So really take the time and look at previous awards to see if that would be a good fit for your school. Also, alignment with the strategic plan and programs of an organization. So preference priorities in a grant, typically those are listed in the first couple pages of a solicitation or a NOFO, where they list the preference priorities when they're reviewing the grant. So looking at specific target populations. So are they serving students between, K through 12 or K through 5? So you really want to match that target population with those that you are trying to serve within your school. Also, activities that match the allowable cost. So really pay attention to the section in the grant application of unallowable costs. This tells you what you cannot use the money for. And I can't emphasize this enough. So really pay attention to those unallowable costs, because you don't want to be rejected based on putting some funding in your proposal that is not allowed. So next slide, please. So project timeline. We just put this together to kind of give you a model of what a typical grant timeline might look like. So 12 weeks out, you really want to pull your project team together. Who's going to be helping you develop that project and that grant application? And we usually typically develop a concept paper or a one-page sort of outline of what you're thinking of proposing to do under that grant. Then you want to kind of pull your team's concepts and outlines together 10 weeks out. At 9 weeks out, you want to start thinking about who's going to take the lead in actually writing the proposal. Who's going to put the pen to paper and actually take the lead on that? And then once that person and the team develops that narrative and the application together, at 3 weeks out at least before the deadline, you'll want to have somebody external to the project or external to your organization or your school to actually review the grant. Have them look it over. Does it make sense? Are you meeting all the requirements in the areas of the solicitation that are required? So really having somebody in a fresh set of eyes looking at your application and looking at the review criteria of the grant to really point out some areas that you may want to move around or emphasize to make it a stronger proposal. And then 1 week out from the deadline, you'll really want to have a copy edit or somebody really who has an editorial experience or at least some editing experience to go through it with another fresh set of eyes, make sure the grammar is correct, that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, so that you really have a clean, well-written, clear application ready for submission. And please submit early. Next slide, please. So when you start the planning, looking at that grants overview and that project timeline I just kind of walked you through, the most important stage is planning. You'll want to start early. So you'll want to start at least 2 to 3 months out before the deadline. So working backwards from the deadline to plan out your activities. So that's when you'll want to review the past or current solicitations. You'll want to review previously funded proposals. You'll want to start gathering your baseline data. So demographics, populations you served, any local, regional or national data, and really gathering that together, because that's going to essentially make up your need statement, the why. Why do you need funding, and why is it important that you should receive funding for this grant? So baseline data is really, really important. You want to identify your grant writing team. So who are you going to pull together on your team to actually work on the proposal together? Who's going to be the lead writer? Who's going to take responsibility for actually writing the grant? Who's your program specialist? Who knows the most about this program? For example, who knows the most about your mental health counseling activities within your school? So who can really speak knowledgeably to your program design? And who is your program finance specialist? So this could be your CFO, your accountant, who really knows about your finances and has some specialization in that. And then securing relevant partnerships. So any partnerships you're going to be engaging in with nonprofit organizations or with local law enforcement. For most of those OJJDP and Department of Justice grants, you will have local law enforcement as a partner. And getting those partnerships early. So all of these partnerships will require some kind of letter of commitment or memorandum of understanding. And this outlines the commitment of your partners within that project that you're applying for. So what are they going to do and bring to the table to your project? Next slide. The writing. So we will actually go through this in more detail in our next webinar, Grant Writing 101, which I encourage all of you to attend. But this is just sort of a quick overview to keep in mind when you're actually writing the grant. So write to the review criteria. So in the grant application that you see and review from the agency of that grant, the agency publishes their review criteria, what the reviewers are going to be looking at when they're actually reviewing your grant application and scoring it or giving it points, essentially. It usually appears after the outline of the narrative of the proposal in the solicitation, and it's in the back. So it will say agency review criteria or review criteria, and it will lay out the points given to each section of the grant. It will also give clear criteria of what the reviewers are going to be looking at. So you really want to write to that, because what you want to do is make it easier for the reviewer to sort of check a box and say, yes, they addressed this correctly. Yes, they addressed this in the right order. So make it very easy for the reviewers to understand what you're doing by following the review criteria, and write to that review criteria in the back of the solicitation. Write directly to the agency goals and objectives stated in the solicitation or the NOFO, not what you want to fund. So that is very important. Like I said, in the review criteria, they're going to be taking that very seriously and follow it to a T. So you really want to write to those review criteria. Use the agency's language. Pay close attention to how the solicitation and the NOFO is written, and try to echo that tone, that language that the agency is using to write your proposal. Typically, grant writing is a little bit more formal, but use simple language and try and echo that language of the proposal. Follow the guidelines and structure provided in the application, and provide only what is asked. You're going to have a tight narrative page limitation, so make sure you adhere to that page limitation, but follow the guidelines and the structure of how they lay out the application in the NOFO. Don't stray from it, follow it. Again, you want to make sure the reviewers know exactly what you're doing in the proposal, and they will want to see an application that follows the NOFO guidance and the guidelines carefully and accurately. So when you're actually writing your narrative or your explanation of what your program is and how you're going to meet the needs of your population and to the application criteria, focus on one or two areas of your organization, of your school, of what you're doing well. What makes your program or your project unique? What are you doing differently from other schools or other LEAs? What are you doing that's innovative? Or what kind of gives you that hook to say to reviewers, hey, we're unique, we're really good at what we're doing, and here's why. So really come prepared to kind of address that hook in your application. Lastly, once you have your narrative or the explanation of what your project is and looking at your budget, make sure they align. So align what you're saying in your narrative. We're going to do X, Y, and Z and implement these activities in order to meet those goals and objectives in our narrative. Make sure you have your budget aligning with what you say, what you're going to do, and you're matching your budget to those activities. So when you're reviewing and when your other expert, your outside person is reviewing your grant, make sure they look at your narrative and your budget maybe together or one after the other so that they can ensure that your budget meets your narrative. Next slide. So step number 3 is reviewing. So review your draft. And again, review your budget and make sure it aligns with your budget justification and your narrative. So make sure those two things align so the reviewers see, these are the activities you're going to do and your budget aligns perfectly with what you say you're going to do. Review all your attachments. So all federal grants have quite a few attachments. These can include resumes or bio sketches. You will have a budget, and this is a budget form typically, but you will also have a budget, what they call a budget justification. And this is kind of just a word explanation of your budget items. So what kinds of equipment are you requesting? You kind of give an explanation about how you came to that overall calculation in your budget. You're going to have personnel. You're going to have supplies. What types of supplies are you going to need? Paper, pens, pencils, any kind of supplies that you're bringing to the activities to support the activities of your grant. And really make sure that all of your attachments are clear and follow the requirements of the solicitation and that you have completed all the attachments. So you do not want to be disqualified from being funded just because you missed or did not update or upload a required attachment. So pay attention to those also in the solicitation. Ask somebody outside your project team to review your application. Again, having another set of eyes look over your application so that you can make some significant changes before the application is due, and to make sure it makes sense, it's readable, and they understand exactly what you're trying to do with this grant application. And make sure they use the scoring criteria in the grant while they're reviewing. So each section of a grant proposal has different scoring levels. So one section may have more points than another. So you want to make sure that you're maximizing your narrative to make sure you get the maximum number of points for each section of that grant proposal. So it's really important to have someone review your grant proposal before you put it in. Make sure you have all your attachments, making sure your budget matches your narrative, and make sure it makes sense and it's readable and understandable to reviewers. So next slide, please. Submitting. This is really important. This is what the steps you will want to take before you actually hit that submit button in grants.gov or Just Grants or whatever federal grant portal you're actually submitting your grant through. Make sure your application goes through the proper internal approvals prior to the submission. So this should be through your CFO, your executive, your principal, whomever has the most, is the authority to make sure your application is meeting all the requirements and that you're not asking for budget items that they didn't know about or aren't aware of or may result in other issues down the line. So you really want to make sure that everybody knows what you're submitting your grant for, what the funding you're requesting, and make sure everybody has approval before you hit that submit button. Make sure there's a backup person with the log information to submit. This is really important. So on the day of submission, you make sure that that person has the login information, has the password, and that there's another person at your organization who has that login and that password information. If they get sick, if they're traveling, if something unexpected comes up and they're unable to submit, you have a backup person that is able to do that. So I can't emphasize that enough. Have at least one or two people, more than two people at your organization who are able to submit that grant, or at least have the passwords available in order to allow you to submit on time. And as we always say, submit early. Always, always, always try and submit at least 2 to 3 days before that grant is due. Online submission portals like grants.gov and Just Grants are not perfect. Sometimes you will get some technical glitches, and you will have to respond to something that went wrong on their side or on your side. So you want to be able to have enough time to address those technical errors that may come in, so that you can address those and still have time to resubmit before the deadline. Doesn't happen often, but you really want to plan ahead, so that submitting early should always, always, always be your goal. So next slide. So you've submitted your grant and now you're waiting. So what does that review process look like? So each agency has a set of reviewers who will review your grant application. You can actually apply with a federal agency to become a reviewer. So if you do ever have an interest in doing that, I would encourage you to do so. You can do that through the agency websites. There's always a little link on the main page of most agencies saying that interested in becoming a reviewer, and you can send in a review application to become a reviewer. And that's a great way to learn more about the review process. But what does the review process look like once the grant goes into the agency? Where does it go from there? Well, it will go to a review panel, typically more than one. The first review panel will actually look at your application, make sure it meets all the review criteria. You haven't missed any attachments or anything like that. So the first is really a content review. Do you follow all the requirements of the solicitation? Is it engaging? Is it compelling? And then after that review process, it typically goes to a budget review. And this is, they will look at your budget in alignment with your project application, make sure the budget makes a lot of sense and makes sense for the application that you've sent in. So it's typically a 2-stage review process. It takes about 6 months, typically 5 to 6 months, unless it's noted in the solicitation that it will be earlier, but you can on average, estimate about 5 to 6 months for that review to take place. What you do while you're waiting to hear back, well, keep an eye on your email. Sometimes, and very often, if in that second review, in the budget review, you may get questions from the program officer about something in your application that you will want to address. It looks like if you do get questions, it means they're serious about your application and that they're looking at it for funding. So do pay attention to your email or whomever has submitted your grant as your AOR for any kind of questions from the program officer that you'll want to address. Next slide. Resubmitting. So please don't be frustrated or disappointed if you're not funded on the first round. When you get into doing grants, there will be some you win and some you don't. But do not get frustrated. A lot of the grants that we discussed today through BISCA, a lot of the school violence grants, in fact, all of the ones that we reviewed today are annual. So you can actually reapply in the next round of funding. You will really want to pay attention to the review feedback. So if you are not awarded in this first round, you will receive agency feedback. They'll actually send you a reviewer's history. So you'll get a summary of the reviewer's comments, and you will get a score of your application. So if you scored highly or sort of middle of the road, you will get some really helpful reviewer comments back from the review panels. Agencies may not always fund on this first submission. So a couple of agencies like the National Institutes of Health or NSF, which you're not going to be applying for, but those agencies typically don't fund on the first round. And feedback improves the draft. So when you receive that feedback from the program officer, you really want to read through it carefully, make notes on it, make notes in your narrative application. If they had made comments about your budget, you'll want to address those too. So that really gives you a really good roadmap for improving your previous application and get it ready for the next submission. So you'll have a lot of time between your declination or your reviewer comments and rewriting and reworking your proposal to make it so much more competitive in the next round so that you have a greater chance of being funded in the next year. And we always suggest when you're talking about revising your submission, you might want to think about, in addition to reworking your proposal, many program officers are amenable to scheduling a call with them where you can walk through the reviewer comments. Maybe if you don't agree with some of the reviewer comments and you want to ask questions, the program officers can be a really good resource for you in strengthening your proposal and addressing those reviewer panel comments appropriately to really strengthen your application. And then again, resubmit. I can't encourage you enough. If you're not successful on the first round, you may be successful on the second round if you really take that reviewer feedback into consideration and really work hard and reviewing and strengthening your proposal for the next round. So next slide. So here's our resources page. And I know there's a lot of resources as well on the GGI website that I'm sure you can turn to Sasha and also Alyssa too, that will be providing additional resources on the GGI website. The Greenlights Grant Initiative will provide a tailored and free resources on their website in addition to the webinars and the office hours we will be doing later in January. We really encourage you to kind of look at these resources in order to start preparing yourself to apply for a federal grants. So as I had mentioned before at the beginning of this webinar, that we'll be doing a series of these writing webinars. Our next one is going to be Federal Grant Writing 101. That's going to be on October 10th, and that's really going to dive a lot deeper into the actual writing process and helping you really prepare for and to help you start actually writing a federal grant as you move forward. So next slide. So I think we've got some time to open it up to questions. I know Tori is going to be assisting with going through some of those questions that you've asked during the webinar. So we're going to go ahead and address those. I will say at the end, if we don't have enough time to address all of your questions today, we will be producing a document that will outline all of the questions and the answers that you all asked today. And then we will share those out in addition to a copy of these slides today so that you can look back at the slides and some of the links and the resources to start your registrations and to kind of review some of the points we made today. So I really encourage you to do that and to also reflect also on the GGI website for additional resources that you can tap into that are free to help you prepare in planning to go for some of these federal grants. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here and we'll start taking some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. We have a couple questions that are rolling in, and I think this is a really good question asked by Tracy Boothman. And her question is it possible during the project team planning time to speak with a grant officer in order to see if the basic idea of the grant is aligned with what readers or decision makers are looking for? She's had some luck with grant officers giving her feedback in the team planning phase in the past.
Yes, and that's a very, very good question. Yes, some agencies are not so amenable, but I've had really good luck, and we have two here at MNQ in tapping into that resource. So yes, that's a great point and a great question to bring up. Use those program officers. They are available and they're actually there to help you in your application process. They can also really provide some great feedback on a project idea. That's where we had come back earlier in the presentation to talk about this one-page concept paper I really encourage you to put a one-pager together if you've got an idea that you think might fit within one of these grant applications. You can send that you can email it to the program officer and ask them for a call and to walk through your project idea even before you apply, so you can get some early feedback on your idea. And they may provide some really good feedback on how to maybe change your idea a little bit or emphasize a certain aspect of your idea to make you much more competitive for that particular grant application. So that's an excellent question, and I do encourage everybody to do that.
Great, thank you, Annie. So another question is, can we get more than one grant in a year? You're muted.
Yes, that's a very good question. In short, yes, you can apply for more than one grant in a year. However, you want to make sure that you are not duplicating your grant application activities. So there is a rule in all federal funding that you can't, what we say is double dip. This means you can't request funding for the same activities across grants. So for example, if you're applying for a SAMHSA grant for mental health services or counseling, you cannot then request grant funding, federal funding for those same activities in two different grants. So you can't duplicate, is what I'm saying, even across agencies, because you will only be funded for one of those grants. So if you're awarded for both for the same activities, you can only take one, you cannot take both.
Great. We have another question sent in. If you're a new teacher that has graduated from college, can you still apply for the grants if you have not yet applied to a specific school district, or do you have to apply for grants once you are hired by a school district?
That's a very good question. You cannot apply as an individual. You need to apply through your school or your school district. So once you become employed at the school or within the district, you can apply with a team on behalf of that individual school, because federal grants, you will be funded through an entity, through a nonprofit or an educational association, an LEA or an SEA, not as an individual, but you can apply on behalf of the school in which you work for.
Great. Another good question here. What is the difference between supplement and supplant?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So supplement is actually to use monies that will help support and expand programming, and supplant is replacement. I think I got that right. But it's basically also duplication of funding for certain activities. I hope that answered your question.
We have another question here on FOIA protocol.
Yes.
Is there a proper protocol, or how would you suggest applicants go about requesting a Freedom of Information Act for a previously awarded proposal?
Yes, that's a very good question. So what you will need, based on the agency that you're requesting from, and you request directly from the agency, you will need to go through and have the solicitation number of that particular grant. If you look at a solicitation typically on the first page of the NOFO, it will give the funding opportunity number. So you'll want to cite that. And then you will want the name of the organization that was funded for that particular grant to make the request of the federal agency. They may have a FOIA fee that can be, I think, $10 or as upwards of $20 per application requested. So those two numbers and those two things you'll really need is the funding opportunity number, and you'll need the title or the agency that was funded for that particular grant, so they can look it up and send you the FOIA, the copy of the grant. The grant will have some areas blocked out for privacy. So for example, the budget in a FOIA will mostly be blacked out because they cannot share salaries or proprietary information from an organization. But mostly you'll get a copy of the narrative and you can see what types of activities were funded through a FOIA. So you'll have to go directly to the funding agency. They do have information on the agency website on how to request a FOIA, but again, you'll need that funding opportunity number. You'll need the specific name of the organization that was funded, and you may be required to pay a fee for the processing of that. It's usually to cover postage and for actually the copying of that application. But every agency is different in terms of what they require, what they fund, or what they require in terms of payment for a copy of the FOIA.
Great. We have another question here.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have a track record of small to medium grants before going for a large federal grant. Is there a rule of thumb with these particular grant sources?
No, I wouldn't say that there's no rule that you have to be funded before that you apply for a larger grant. You do just have to meet the eligibility criteria. Again, I would really look at that in terms of the eligibility criteria and look again at who they've funded in the past. So make sure your project design meets that larger grant. So is your population large enough to be competitive? Are your priorities in line with the larger grants priorities as well, to make sure that it's a good fit? But there's no rule to say that if you have not been funded for a larger grant that you're automatically prohibited from applying to that grant. Just make sure you look at the eligibility criteria and review who they funded before. That's a great indicator too, to make sure that your organization or your school is ready to apply for that larger grant, that you can actually manage that size of a grant too if you're awarded. Those are all important points of consideration.
We have another question here. This one's focused on grants.gov. Someone says that they're on grants.gov and need to filter eligibility on K-12 school districts, but don't see it as an option. Do you have any suggestions on which options or that should be selected to help an LEA, find eligible grants?
That's a really good question. So on the filter side, you're saying that there's no filter for LEAs and LEAs specifically. What you can filter for is for key terms, or you can filter for agency. So what you can do is just filter for all Department of Education grants. And there may be some additional filters there for schools and school districts, but if you're not able to filter for that, you can filter for keywords. So like if you're looking for counseling or mental health services, you can filter for that, or just, choose the Department of Education K through 12 as a filter for looking up those grants.
Great. We have another question on eligibility. What if you work for an independent private school in need of support? We are also seeking funding for school security.
Yeah, you'll need to look at the eligibility criteria in all of the grants. So there may be limitations in terms of nonprofit. If your school is registered as a nonprofit, you may be eligible to apply for those grants. But again, you'll have to look at the eligibility criteria of that separate NOFR, of that separate solicitation, to make sure you're actually eligible as a private entity to apply for security grants.
Great. Another question here. Do federal agencies publish previously funded organizations, or do they have a 990 to look at similar a 990 type of document similar to nonprofits to look at?
Oh, that's a good question. So within the, when the grants are funded through a federal agency, they typically list the organizations that were funded. So sometimes they'll certainly list the name of the organization and the amount. Some agencies, it really depends agency to agency, but a lot of the agencies will also publish just a short, what we call an abstract, or short explanation of what that grant, what that agency or organization was funded for under that particular grant. But most of the agencies like SAMHSA, DOJ, OJJDP, all of those award lists are posted on the agency's websites that you can look into and see who was funded in the previous round. And I think, Tori, too, that a lot of the memos that have been provided on a lot of these grants have links to those already. that you can look through previously awarded organizations. And there's also a link to the previous solicitation that you can read through in preparation for applying in this next spring. So when the solicitations come out in early 2024, you'll be prepared. I hope that answers your question. But most of the agencies do list those with links to the funded the funded organizations with the budget amount and some of the explanation of what they were funded for. So all of those are good resources to look into.
Great. So we have another question here saying that I'm sure this varies on a case-by-case basis, but I work with a handful of districts that are located in well-off socioeconomic areas on paper, but many of their schools are in high-risk areas. As a result, they historically have a very low success rate when applying to grants, particularly related to safety and security, and are hesitant to try anymore. Do you have any words of advice for them or have come across similar scenarios where you've been successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we work with a nonprofit organization in a location that's seen as being very affluent, but in reality, their school district kind of borders on a very low income area with a lot of underserved populations. And what we focused on was really explaining and make it very clear to the funding agency. We actually used a graphic, a map, to show the split within the county of where those schools were in comparison to the more affluent areas of the county, and really going towards the data and showing the program officers, look, yes, the misnomer is that this whole county is a very wealthy area, but there are serious pockets of low income, high risk, underrepresented populations that need to be served. And these are the populations that we're going to be focusing on with this grant. So really, really emphasizing and spending a lot of time showing them the need in that district and focusing on those schools in that area. If there are high crime rates around those schools and within those communities, really try and get that information from resources like the Department of Justice. Also, your county information, your county census information is a really important resource that you can tap into and really make it clear. Use graphs and use maps in your application to actually physically show where these schools are, and then highlighting some of those areas of need and showing where the poverty is, showing where there's prevalence, maybe there's gang violence, or maybe there's a lot of crime rates within those areas, and really making it clear to the reviewers, hey, the county on the whole or the area on the whole may be seen as affluent, but there are pockets that are really in need, and particularly where these schools lie. So just trying to tell the story and really explain it well, and use any evidence you can pull from local data or mapping tools or county photographs or anything like that you can show to really emphasize that point of need in your application. We've had good luck with that in terms of really emphasizing that, even in areas where that may be seen as being more affluent or not as needy as other areas. So really emphasize that need statement with any data you can find, and making it easy for the reviewers to really see what that area is really like on the ground.
Thank you, Annie. And I'm receiving a lot of questions on whether or not these slides will be made available after the presentation, and the answer is yes. We will make these available both on the website and email to all participants who've registered.
Yes.
All right, we have another question here. Excuse me. What types of data should we start to collect in preparation for these grants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, Tori, we're doing another webinar that kind of digs into that issue of collecting data and effective data. But I would say start with your most basic data. Start with your demographics. What does your school population look like? Where is the school located in the community? What's the community like? So are there Issues of crime. Do you have large gang prevalence? Has there been issues of violence in the community? Use newspaper articles, recent press articles from your local papers. Really start collecting information locally on your population and looking at poverty rates, looking at census data from the US Census. They have great free online data that you can pull off your school district and to really give them a snapshot. So really start pulling together that target population data, really start collecting data on your overall student population. What do they look like? Has there been any issues of violence recently in the community? Have there been other issues of trauma in the community? For example, we've seen a lot of damage from hurricanes, from forest fires, from any other trauma-induced kind of activities that are going on in the community. So start collecting that information, the really basic community profile data, your student population, your student profile data, look at your history of funding. That's also an important issue. Has there been reductions in school district funding in your state? So really start collecting that basic, I would say start with your demographic data around your student population, looking at poverty, census data, and start there and really start kind of creating a story around the community in which your schools lie. And keep it updated. Also, when you start collecting this data, update it annually so that you really have the most current data that you can share with any funder when you're starting to move forward and applying for federal grants.
Great. Another question here on partnerships. Do we need to have a lot of partners in the community to be competitive for a grant?
I would say any federal grant that you apply for, you will need a partner. That makes your application stronger. And now it's kind of a common knowledge around grants is that you will need partners for any successful grant application. So for example, in the OJJDP grants and the COPS grants that we reviewed earlier in the webinar, you're going to need partnerships from local law enforcement. You'll want to have partnerships from any nonprofit organizations who you work with, who may be helping you to serve students within your school in terms of providing behavioral health services in the school during school hours or after school. So any partnerships that you have with any nonprofit or community-based organization that can assist you with providing services to your students. So yes, partnerships are very important. I would say I would not apply for a larger federal grant without partnerships. And the more partners you have, the more successful I think you will be, not only in terms of implementing your project, but also showing the reviewers and the federal reviewers of these grants that this is a community-based response to this issue and that you're not alone and that you're working with other entities in your community to make sure that this project is a success.
Great, thank you, Annie. Another question is on the reporting side of things. If we are to get a grant, how do we know how often we have to report to the government?
That is a great question. So when you are funded a federal grant, you will have a program officer appointed to your grant program at the agency. So you will have one person, one point of contact at that agency that you keep in touch with. This is particularly important once you get started with actually implementing your grant. If you need any kind of budgetary changes, if you need to move items around in your budget for any reason, you'll need to talk to them before you do so and say, hey, we're seeing that we need a little bit more money for supplies, or we need a little bit more money for equipment, but we only put this amount in our funded budget. Can we make it a budget adjustment and change that budget around? So that's a really important relationship to have. And that program officer is actually going to send you way ahead of time templates that you will use to actually report. And those templates are usually come through email, and they'll send you a template and say, hey, here's your quarterly report. please complete this and return to us in 2 months or so. So they will give you time to actually do the reporting. There's usually 2 aspects of the reporting. One is the financial. So they'll want to see how much you've spent down from your grant in financial terms. And usually that's just a spreadsheet of finances that your CFO or whomever is responsible for your financing or your accounting to do the financing side of it. And then the other side is the programmatic. So they'll want to hear, hey, what did you do this quarter? In terms of activities, that what you said you were going to do and what you were funded to do within, your program activities within the narrative. So they'll want you to explain what you've done to date, and they'll also want to see how the expenditures align with that. But there'll be a template, and you'll have time to complete that and return it to the program officer as part of your reporting. Usually the end of year report is longer. Some organizations or some agencies require a quarterly or sort of like a semester mid-year report. Just depends on the grant. And you'll see that it's actually outlined in the back of the solicitation. So when you're applying for that grant, look at the reporting requirements that are usually towards the end of the solicitation. It'll give you an idea of when and how many reports you will be responsible for completing throughout the term of the grant.
Great. Another question here on data. When you are putting together your data to tell your narrative and support your explanations within the attachment section, can you submit videos? And if yes, what format is acceptable?
That's a very good question. That's very dependent on the solicitation. Typically not, because it takes too much memory. I don't know if I've ever worked on one where we submitted a video within the application, just because the files are so large. Typically, most grant applications only take picture format. They take PDF, some take Excel, but I've not seen one that has allowed for like the upload of a video, but certainly photos are allowable. So if you're doing any kind of refurbishing within your school or anything like that, and you'll want to show a graphic of what you're doing and what the outline of the refurbishing is, you can upload photographs, but typically not videos, not that I have seen in my experience.
We have another question. Have you seen a rise in leadership requiring submission rights due to the tie-in between SAM.gov and Just Grants and grants.gov? This person said they've used to submit grants 1 year with superintendent signature each following year.
Oh, is that Tori? Is that related to an AOR?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think it needs to be your superintendent that has to upload and actually apply. You have to designate who that person is going to be at your particular school or your school district. So that's entirely up to you to designate that AOR or multiple AORs at your school.
Could you remind us what an AOR is?
Sure. It's an agency or authorized organizational representative. And this is the person who actually has the authority to upload and submit grants. They're going to be your main organization or school contact for all things grant related. So in some organizations and in some schools, that may be the superintendent, it may be the principal, or it could be somebody just in your administrative offices who's taking the lead and who's going to track the grants and be the main contact. For example, when you receive the grant, that person, that AOR, is going to be the one the program officer corresponds with for all the reporting requirements. So it's that main local entity point of contact. So you can essentially determine who that is at your school. It could be the principal, or you could decide it's not. It's going to be somebody else who's a little bit more accessible and closer to the actual grant application. So maybe somebody on the team who actually worked on the grant might be a good person to be your AOR. But again, you also may want more than one AOR at your organization, just in case somebody at the school leaves or moves to another school, and then they take their password and their registration with them. So you really want to have more than one person at your school be designated an AOR so that there's always somebody there who's the main contact. as the AOR at your organization.
Thanks, Annie. We have
Mhm.
another question here on just grants.gov in general. Do we have to re-register every year for grants.gov?
I believe it's not necessarily annual, but you would want to upgrade your registration annually in case somebody at your organization has changed. But I would just go ahead and make sure your registration's up to date annually with grants.gov as well. I know SAMS is annual, so you do have to re-register and make sure your SAMS, this is your System of Award Management ID. This is the actual way you're actually going to receive the funding. If you're awarded, you need to make sure that SAM's registration is kept current, and that they typically send you an email, or the AOR an email through SAM, saying that your SAM's registration is soon expiring, so that they give you a little lead time to be able to update your registration. But grants.gov, you should also keep that annually updated, particularly if people leave the organization and you need to designate a new AOR.
A related question, does the fiscal agent need to be the same as the AOR? And what is a fiscal agent?
Your fiscal agent is the person who is responsible for all your accounting. So this is your finance officer. And no, it doesn't need to be the same person. Some organizations do have it as their as the same person, but it's not required.
Great. And then we have just another more general question on what are some examples of things that typically cannot be funded with a federal grant?
Oh, that's a very good question. Typically food, unless it's directly related to the program. So this would be, you can't just buy lunch for everybody with federal grant money unless it's part of the programming. If you're doing any programming over a lunch hour, then you might be able to, but we usually say no food in a federal application. Certainly no alcohol is allowed in a federal application, so no happy hours. You cannot typically fund any type of construction. So the federal government will not fund bricks and mortar, we say. So they do not buy buildings. You may be able to use some funding for refurbishment for a project, but certainly for not construction. Within each solicitation, there is also a list in the back or towards the in the budget section of a NOFO that says unallowable activities. And you should highlight those when you're going through the solicitation to make sure you're not requesting any monies, any federal funding for any of those activities. So they lay it out pretty clearly within each NOFO what's unallowable to be used under your budget, but there are also some just general government-wide unallowable use of funds. And I explained some of those just earlier about food and alcohol, and there's some other restrictions, no construction, but there are some agency-wide, federal government-wide restrictions on some. But for your purposes, I would pay more attention to what's in that specific solicitation for unallowable expenditures.
Great. And just a few more participants, if you still have any questions, please feel free to keep those coming. Mm-hmm. Another question, excuse me. Can we get more than one grant in a year?
Yes, you can. But I will say again, I think we had that question earlier, is just make sure that you're not what we call double dipping. So you can't request federal funding for the same activities in the same year. So if you are looking at or applying to 2 different federal grants for school violence prevention, and you're asking within each of those 2 separate solicitations funding for the same activities, if you are awarded both, you have to give one up. You can't be awarded for both for the same activity. So there's no what we call double dipping. You can't receive twice the funding for the same activities through the federal government. So you can only be funded for the same activities once.
Great. We have another question here. Is there a specific solicitation we should look to if we are seeking funds to aid in the remodeling of our building entrances to make them more secure?
Yeah, I think quite a few of those grants in terms of improving school safety and school security. I know I've worked on some grants that were talking about funding electronic locks within the school. So having a like a slide card or a key card entry. I've also worked with some schools that have also done security apps on phones. So there are a wide range of activities you can do, and there is some refurbishment or some, we would say, security equipment that schools can implement with some of those grants. I would say that I would look specifically at each of those solicitations to make sure that that there are no restrictions around refurbishment, because each grant is different and funds different aspects of school security. So you'll really have to pay attention to the allowable funding activities in each of those grants, because they vary between the Department of Justice and also through the Department of Education. So you'll just have to look at each solicitation to make sure that there are no restrictions on those types of activities.
We have another question here. Do you have examples of folks using these grants to help get funding for cellular boosting equipment, which help ensure schools have cell phone signal in the building?
That's a very good question. I have worked with organizations, again, who've used more security apps on their phones. I have not specifically worked one that is improving cell phone service. It doesn't mean that it's not allowable. I just have not worked, in my experience, on an application that addresses that, but it may be allowable in some of the Department of Education grants that we covered under the security grants.
Great. Let's say you apply to multiple grants for funding a program. One application goes towards staff and capacity building for the same program, and another goes to supplies. Would this work?
Oh, if you're asking for separate activities in two different grants, then yes, as long as they're not duplicative.
Great. And then another question on matching. Some grants require matching. Are there any restrictions or guidance here?
Yes. So some federal grants require matches, and that can be a 1-to-1, which means for each federal dollar, you have to match it with private sources. Some matching requirements, and I would say that most of the federal grants that I've worked on have either a cash match, which means you're getting funding from another source, like a private foundation, to match the funding that you are requesting from the federal government, or there's something that we call in-kind matching. And that means in-kind funding from your school. So for example, you are going to provide the room, you're going to provide other resources like staffing or supplies or equipment that you are not requesting funding for through the grant, but you're actually kind of donating to the running of the project and the success of the project. You can make estimates based on that in-kind contribution, so staff time, equipment costs, supply costs, as in-kind match to those federal dollars. So it's what your school is already giving in terms of personnel or any other resources to that project as match. It's not a direct cash match. It's more of time, resources, equipment that you are contributing and bringing to the project that can be estimated and translated into dollars. So that's what we call in-kind match. So really look at the solicitation. Some require a 1-to-1 match. Some require a percentage. So for example, 25% of your total federal request has to be matched. And they will say the match can be private, cash, or in kind. So you can also mix the two. If you have some foundation funding that is going towards this project that you can count as cash match. And then there may be other additional resources that you're actually bringing to the table that you can estimate as part of that in-kind match. That's a really good question, but really do pay attention to those match requirements and the percentage of match within that specific solicitation.
Thank you, Annie. And I think that concludes our questionnaire portion for now.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. So thank you again for joining the first GGI webinar. We were really happy to have so many people join. As many of you know, the Greenlights Grant Initiative is a project of the Just Keep Livin Foundation, also founded by Camilla and Matthew McConaughey. And that organization empowers high school students by providing them with necessary tools to lead active lives and make healthy choices for a brighter and better future. I Just Keep Livin operates school fitness and wellness programs in 40 plus inner city high schools and sites. And the results have been truly amazing. And we know GGI will be just as impactful with all of your participation. So we truly can't thank you enough. I'd also like to thank Annie and the entire McAllister and Quinn team again, and Sasha and the American Association of School Superintendents. I know we covered a lot of ground today, and as Annie said, we'll be sharing these slides and an FAQ document with all of you in the next few days, so please stay on the lookout for that. And in the meantime, we encourage everyone to routinely check our website, www.greenlightsgrantinitiative.org, for additional resources, including the Federal Grant Writing 101 webinar in October that Annie mentioned. You can register for that through the website as well. So we'll see you again soon, and thank you again for joining.